5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
How can we make operating in space safe and sustainable for everyone? Given the risks we face up there, like space debris and even adversarial actors. This is where a company like Slingshot Aerospace comes in, with its sensors, data, and insights derived from that data. My guest this week is their CEO, Tim Solms. Enjoy. Hey space enthusiasts, welcome back to another episode of the Space Business Podcast. Very happy today to have as my guest Tim Solms, and he's the CEO of Slingshot Aerospace. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you so much, Raphael. It's a pleasure to be here, and big fan of what you're doing and your ability to connect the community with broader space topics. So no pressure here, but look forward to talking to
you. Pressure is on both of us, but thank you for your kind words, Tim. So why don't we start off as we usually start off when we have a guest on from a company? Why don't you give us sort of, as in the startup world, we would call the elevator pitch about what Slingshot is doing?
Well, before I talk about Slingshot, I always have to have a nod to our co-founders, because they really did something that was both brilliant and elegant. And the three co-founders of Slingshot are Melanie Strickland, who is extremely well known within the community, Tommy Ashman, and then David Godwin. And Melanie and Tommy were in the Air Force, what is now Space Force, both in uniform, grew up in the world of space operations, and keenly focused on the fact that it was scaling at a pace that the government was going to struggle to appropriately address. So very, very mission focused. And then they wisely saw there is a massive spike coming in launches with the associated payloads with those. And I think they both made the very difficult decision to take off a uniform and come and start Slingshot. So they went and found a third co-founder, David Godwin, who had a history with startups and how to fund and how to organize. But the brainchild, what is Slingshot today, what I'm allowed to run today as the CEO, really came from Melanie Strickland, first and foremost, and then Tommy Ashman, who was partnered with her on that one. And I do applaud, I talk about the elegance of what they do. They very quickly focused in on what I call the downstream side of space, and kept the company focused there, so that when I was able to come in and take over into the growth stage, it was very, very clear about what our intent was and what missions that we were going to support. So I do start with that. So Slingshot is fundamentally a data and AI company, and we focus on space as the market, for which I'm very, very grateful. We really look at the three parts. The problem side of space that we look at is the congested nature of operations, right? So more participation, more congestion, the complexity that comes with the congested nature of orbital operations. And then a little bit uniquely, given our DNA and the defense side of business, we look at the contested side of space as well. It is as you know, a very active warfighting domain. And so we do, work very, very closely with the U.S. and U.S. allies on the offense and defensive side of space.
That makes sense. And so for all of these three aspects, as you mentioned, correct me if I say something stupid, basically what you need to know what's going on in space. You need to know the data of what's happening, what objects are moving around, who's moving around. What is that? That's basically.
Ultimately, I spent a career as an attack pilot, so it's what I call situational awareness. So the SA of space, which means, how can I responsibly get in and out of orbit? How can I responsibly maintain orbit? And the denominator that we measure really is time, right? How much time do I have to make a decision? How many times do I have to maneuver to be able to maintain orbit? How much time can I keep that object in its mission box? And then ultimately, from a sustainability perspective, how much time can I keep that object in orbit, performing its mission, for as long as possible? So that's the return on investment piece. And so, and that's just for normal operations. The other situational awareness piece is, do we know what's up there and around us? What is the intent of those objects, or how should they be behaving? And when we see something anomalous, is it nefarious, right? And our ability to very quickly detect, assess, curate that data in the data chain, and then get those insights to people for whom they matter. A little bit about what we do. We have a worldwide network of sensors. We are all terrestrial. We have nothing in orbit, right? But we have ground sensors that are all over the world. They are optical sensors. So those optical sensors are throwing off two types of data, astrometric data and then photometric data. And there's an elegance to how we've been able to continue to curate and improve on our optical sensors, where that photometric data can tell us a lot about an object. The second piece of that is we have contextual intelligence. We did an acquisition out of the UK of a company called Saradata. Saradata, I call them the trained spotters of space. Every contextual bit of information that is known or could be known about an object, going back to Sputnik, where it came from, who funded it, components, subcomponents, how does it communicate, how much fuel on board, just everything we can know about an object. And that feeds obviously into our AI models. And then ultimately that AI piece, which allows us to understand, both the synthetic data and then the known data for us to be able to answer for space operators, what is going on in space and give them that situational awareness.
So maybe if I follow on that, so just to understand a little bit better to what level or what kind of data you evaluate, right? So if I very simplistically look at this in sort of two dimensions, let's call it, one is sort of a location dimension, right? It could be stuff that's going on in LEO, it could be stuff that's going on in GEO, and I guess in theory we could even move beyond that, like cislunar space and things like that, right? So that's
we constantly collect across 4 orbital domains from VLEO all the way up to cislunar. So we are collecting and aggregating data on those 4 orbits
okay.
24/7.
Terrific. And then, so that was one dimension, and so you answered that. The second dimension was, which you kind of started touching upon, is, so I guess, I don't know how to describe it. It's somewhat a little bit, I guess, about the resolution of the object, right? Because on one sort of like more macro scale, you could see what's going on, what's flying around, or something is flying there. It's going to intersect with your satellite's orbit. You better do like, there might be a very high conjunction as a collision risk. You better move your satellite around, right?
Sure.
But you may not actually know what that thing exactly is that's flying around, right? And then on the other hand, you may have actually like possibly a desire to get very detailed knowledge, like, oh, that thing that's flying around, actually it's like some adversarial satellite and it has these features and seems to have this sensor and it's doing this, that's interesting. I think something that people sometimes call space object identification. On that spectrum of activity, where do you guys look to act?
We have what we call unicorns. Like those are objects that are either not shared in public space data catalogs that we see and monitor. And in some instances, again, you were talking about that astrometric data. That photometric data combined with the contextual intelligence gives us a lot of indicators about what those objects are, whether they were an advertised payload or not, or an advertised rocket body or not. Our astrodynamicists, our orbital engineers are very good, very adept at interpreting that photometry to be able to say, hey, we have a pretty good idea of what this is, where it came from, what's it supposed to be doing, right? So if everything's going as advertised, we're just watching. And I should back up. We really have 2 families of sensors. We have all staring arrays, passive sensors. They are watching. When I keep nodding back to our co-founders, that whole idea that we're going to watch passively 4 orbits, and that gives us the ability to then see that the instant we see something that's anomalous, built into our processing software, it'll task a gimbal sensor where we can go take custody of that object and then maintain custody of that object as it continues to orbit. So that more often than not gives us sort of the first mover advantage. Like, we saw something. So we are typically notifying our customers, whether they're commercial customers, government customers, allied customers, something anomalous just occurred. We are maintaining custody and we'll continue to report on that object. So imagine that from, like I said, from the the congested, right? All the things that come with congested orbital operations, the complex, which says, okay, I'm operating in these highly dynamic regimes, and therefore there's a complexity that comes that means I have to know things faster and faster, constantly, that need for information. And then ultimately the contested side, which says, hey, we saw something anomalous. Is that nefarious? Is that a bad actor? Or is that something we should be concerned about?
Okay, so it sounds there's basically, so there's first like passive surveillance, and then there's a sort of a tasking element if it makes sense. Kind of like if I made a very simplistic comparison, like there might be a security camera overlooking a parking lot, and most of the time it's just looking at the entire parking lot, and suddenly a security guard or an AI spots or somebody's maybe breaking into a car. Let's like move the camera and zoom in and see what's
So
going
imagine
on.
if the camera continues to maintain full coverage and then it tips and cues a very refined sensor to then go look specifically at that car. And I think you're onto something. Right?
Gotcha. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then, so speaking of the sensors, so you mentioned optical and all terrestrial for the moment. Is that, I mean, also sort of looking forward in your strategy, do you see it continuing like that, or is there any, do you see any sort of potential gaps in the coverage in the broadest sense, or opportunities to further improve coverage, whether that's by a different sensor technology or maybe taking something to space?
Well, that's interesting. We talk a lot about culture within the company. Culture is a big part of this. I've got a few years on me. Nobody would argue that and what I have found is that culture is the most important aspect to a company's success, right? And it sounds like a platitude, but we do have a culture of innovation within Slingshot that existed long before I arrived. My job is to continue to curate that and make sure that we've got investment capital to support those ideas. But yes, we continue to innovate on our optical sensors, and they have gotten several orders of magnitude better in the less than 2 years that I've been CEO. But as we look forward, we do see a path to having some on-orbit collection capability. Our ground-based sensors, we're doing about 8.5 million to 10 million observations per day, and that has given us the largest corpus of commercially available space data in existence, right? So Slingshot, this 140-person company that's been around for about 8 years, has the largest corpus of commercial space data around. And that, I have tremendous respect for, the other companies that are in our markets, but we have the most sort of comprehensive and detailed space data catalog that's organic to what we're able to derive. Like you said, those passive sensors, those all staring arrays do give us that ability. So with that, we then go, okay, you talked about sort of gaps. Sun synchronous, big topic, right? Sun synchronous orbits. And there are 2 points during the solar cycle where we cannot maintain, about 5% of the total window where we can't maintain tracking of sun synchronous. So, for us, that means, hey, it's time to deploy sensors to, different latitudes, which say that, hey, we can do, and I'll say persistent. There is no persistent, right? There's filling the gaps in with AI, but we can do and report, continuously around sun synchronous. That's one. We also know that as that contested nature continues to escalate, being able to task an on-orbit sensor to take custody of an object will be very important for us. And ultimately, we're trying to bring the value of the data. And again, the data and the curation of the data and those insights, we're trying to bring the value of the insights from informational to decisioning. And any government, struggles with, hey, am I going to use a commercial source to make decisions versus just informative? And there are areas where they have done that. And our job is to make sure that we're doing everything possible so that that becomes a no regret decision for end use customers.
And so just expanding on that a little bit on the data side. Okay, so you said you have the sort of largest proprietary data set, and that's great. But I mean, sort of in any, and I'm machine learning AI guy by academic background actually, right? And so I was like we always taught very early on when you study this that like the more data the better, full stop, right? But there's obviously data out from other sources. Is there a lot of sort of like data sharing going on? And I mean that on various levels. It could be obviously within the US and with some commercial companies. I imagine SpaceX must have a lot of data because they have a lot of things flying up there. But then, of course, the other interesting question is internationally. And then, of course, we start with allies, but then you get to this question, well, probably China and Russia have a lot of space data. And to some extent, it would be good if everyone shared, but I'm going to assume that's probably not happening.
Well, again, I respect I respect the geopolitical strategies that are in play. My job is to make sure that that Slingshot continues to do its part. We are unapologetically patriotic, and we do
Mhm.
we do share quite a bit of data within the allied communities, and think it's important to do that. We respect embargoed nations, and we respect the things that come with that. But providing data to the governments, and then they have to make responsible decisions what they do. But there is quite a bit of data sharing that goes on. We'll see something occur in orbit, and again, our all staring arrays will see something, and we'll notify others that are, that have, RF systems or radar systems that can then go also take a look at those objects, which is critical. So it is a very cooperative environment. We do compete. We do all compete for investor dollars, and that's important. And this market, has to continue to support that, or it will, drive consolidation in the market, whether we want, whether we're ready for it or not. But there is a common understanding that we are trying to provide capability, and as competitive as we are, when it comes to those rare dollars, we do absolutely collaborate, especially on the scientific side. I'm going to say one more thing. You talked about data, and I do believe data is king. And when I look at what our AI team has been able to accomplish and what our sensor team has been able to accomplish, I do take that back to our data is what attracts the talent. Right? They say, hey, I have more data available at Slingshot than I had in my university environment when I was getting my PhD. I can come and do more things with more comprehensive data than anywhere else. Our job is to keep them there and continue to give them interesting things and be able to fund, their innovative ideas. But I do believe that the data is the number one thing that attracts the talent and then gives us the ability to provide, relevancy back to the market.
Okay, and so this, for what you're saying, also, it seems like you're basically vertically integrated, right? So you produce the data, but you're also doing the analysis in-house, or is there any sort of external outsourcing of analysis going on?
No, not really. We have some contracts that ask us, hey, track these 200 objects or track these 300 objects, and that's what we'll do. Can we provide, curation and insights on those? Of course, and sometimes we are asked to do that. But, when I look at our four lines of business, really are, space data as a line of business, which makes up, roughly, I'd say 40% of our total revenue. Space operations, probably another 40%, and the last 20% is really, split out between, infrastructure as a service and then space domain awareness. So, people look at us as a space domain awareness company, but it really is 12% of our total revenue. But the data and the space ops, which is highly driven by AI, are the two, lead lines of business for Slingshot.
That was actually going to be my next question, sort of because we talked about sort of like the broader area where you play. This is why I asked you about locations from LEO all the way to Cisluna and the various types of resolution. But what would you characterize as sort of then the bread and butter business, and who's your bread and butter business customer?
Well, so our customers are rapidly evolving, as you can imagine. So, U.S. government probably makes up the preponderance of our revenue. I'd say allied governments, so UK, Japan, Australia, some in the Middle East, some in Central and South America, are continue to scale. But first and foremost is that data, then the space ops piece. What I see coming in the near future, we had a lot of questions for emerging space nations, right? We want to be able to train and certify our own people. We want sovereign capability. We do not want to rely on the US or others to provide space for us. We want to be able to do it ourselves. So train and certify our people, give us, our sovereign data rights, so that ultimately we can do this. And so we stood up infrastructure as a line of business where, hey, we can build, deploy, maintain, sustain, sensor sites for, a country. And the demand curve on that has exceeded expectations. So that is a big for us. And then lastly is what I would call autonomous operations. As we're analyzing the data and looking at the data trends, I'd say a year ago, we thought that was probably 5 years out. And that has quickly become 7 to 8 quarters out, where we see the larger market, whether it's commercial or even a small commercial operator, all the way up through governments, you're going to have to move to autonomous operations sometime in the next 2 years in order to be able to just maintain, that responsible orbit and maintain the, keeping your objects sustainable in orbit for as long as possible.
Do you think where the community at large or most players are I mean, I think you just said 7 to 8 quarters, right? So that's not a lot. That's like 2 years.
No,
Do you think the ecosystem is prepared and equipped for that? Because I mean, that obviously requires certain things and capabilities if you
well,
want to
what
go
I
to
would
truly autonomous operations.
so what we've done to prepare for that is like, hey, we have to have the most pristine data, the most comprehensive data, the most relevant data, and then the the ML, the AI that goes with it. If you're an operator, you're looking at how do I then connect those insights directly, with hey, I can put in parameters, I can put in preferences, and that is what is going to drive those satellites. But I would completely agree with your topic. It is coming much faster than we expected, and that is just based, we're seeing significantly larger rocket bodies, significantly larger payloads, and they are, the rate at which, that curve, continues to trend more vertically than horizontally. The CDMs coming out every 8 hours are insufficient to, first order, let alone second order impacts on maneuver.
Yeah, so because okay, let's explore this a little bit further. Because again, if you think about what we need, and of course I'm not an expert, so I may say stupid things, right? But so it's not just
You're in good company,
the
right?
it's just not the tech it's not just the technical capabilities for autonomy, right? Sort of like that in an ideal scenario, technologically speaking, you ingest data, there's immediate analysis, there's conjunction warning, there's if it's truly autonomous, that means like no human in the loop kind of signal given to propulsion system to fire, move out of the way, right? There is also some other non-technical arguments, like I was going to say rules of engagement, but that's like it's more like rules of the road, right? So if you
Right.
have two active objects, it's like I don't know, SpaceX and Kuiper. And it's like, right, who's moving where, right? Because that obviously has economical implications, right? The one who moves is going to burn fuel.
Yep.
Do we have that figured out? I mean, so now we're like in the larger topic of space traffic management. So like, where does that all stand?
Well, and so I would say no, it's not completely figured out, right? One of our first acquisitions was a very small company that was sort of a university project, right? And that capability was, hey, we're putting a platform out there for free. Space operators, log on, put in your data, and use it as a way to communicate and deconflict. And we continue to see quite a bit of interest in that, right? And that's again, that's company to company, human to human. But we, our the intent behind that and the reason behind why we made that acquisition, why we continue to put time and R&D dollars into improving that is because we do see that as a presentation services layer, as ability for people, for any space operators to envision and be able to make those decisions. But you're right there. I don't want to get into driving satellites in orbit. I don't think that's what Slingshot should be doing. I see that as the midstream piece, and we are clearly focused on the downstream side of the space continuum. So for us, it is we want to provide again the most pristine and relevant data and the AI that helps make those decisions. But how a company gets from a person on the keyboard inputting commands to we're going to let that direction happen, how are we going to deconflict? In my mind, that goes to the constant improvement around the AI, right? So my parameters that are in there are I'm trying to maintain time in the mission box, or I'm trying to maintain sustainability. But ultimately, self-preservation is going to be a part of that, right? Where at some point it's going to be we're going to deconflict, right? We have to avoid that metal to metal contact.
You don't want to play like the orbital game of chicken, of like the two
Right?
cars racing against each other, and like, yeah.
I mean, we're constantly tracking these things, and that was probably about a year and a half ago. It's one of the, we saw it was going to be about a 60-kilometer pass between two objects. We knew
Wow,
that neither of them had the ability to maneuver, right? They were both,
wow.
objects, and we kind of watched that one happen. I said, okay, that's going to happen more and more.
For
So
our non-technical listeners, we got to keep in mind 60 kilometers in space at the velocities we're talking about is just it's nothing in terms
right,
of.
right. That one got our attention, and we held our breath a little bit on that one. So yeah.
But so where do you, I mean, okay, and I understand that okay, you're a downstream piece, you provide the data, you analyze the data, and then it's maybe for other people, including public policymakers, to figure out. But you're obviously a very important part of the community, so you're obviously involved in all of this. And I must admit, I don't fully understand and have the full knowledge. But maybe you can just give us a few minutes background how that all works currently. I know in the US there's something called the TRAXIS, Traffic Coordination System for Space, right? Which I think is the uh, inside the OST, which is inside Commerce, I think.
It is, yeah.
How how does this all work? And that's just the US, right? So then how does and space then is by nature should be global, right? Because I mean we have global air traffic management, right? Which actually seems to work. You know, I fly a lot and it seems to work, but that probably took decades to develop. But that's much slower speeds than in space, where you know in lower of orbit an object goes around the Earth in 90 minutes. So how does it work in the US? How does it work globally? Just as a quick background.
Remember, our space infrastructure is 70 years old, right, or more. And so when you look at that, the Department of Defense made the decision. They said, okay, with the level of activity of what I would call red versus blue, or the contested part of space, the Department of Defense wanted to shed themselves of the, I'm going to roughly call it the traffic control side, right? There is the traffic control side, and then there's the warfighting side. And DoD says we want to focus on the warfighting side. So we want to pass that mission off to what ultimately landed with Office of Space Commerce. Office of Space Commerce is currently, if you look at it, we have the Secretary of Commerce. Underneath that, we have NOAA. And underneath that, we have the Office of Space Commerce. I do believe there's going to be some movement there, but the TRAX program is really to, collect and curate massive amounts of commercially available data combined with some, government data to have that ability to provide those traffic management services for space. And, we participate that with many other companies, and that's been a great program for us. So it's gone through sort of its proof of concept stage, and we're in that operational layer. And then, we're watching quite a bit of, budgetary maneuvers within the US government right now. And so, I spend quite a bit of time at the legislative level as well as the executive level talking about the critical need for that. And that's beyond the selfish nature of, revenue for Slingshot. It really is, we have a leadership position there right now. When I look at that TRAX as a capability, the European Space Agency has a similar capability. China has a similar capability, and we do think that it is important to maintain that leadership and maintain that, continue to maintain TRAX, develop TRAX, and provide that data. And they do share that very broadly across the full space, ops space. I don't know how they potentially share that with Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, but there are constant geopolitical conversations going on to talk about how we maintain. Like once you're 100 miles above the Earth's surface, there are national agendas, but there are no national borders, right? So it is different than the air traffic control continuum.
Exactly. Yeah, that's where the analogy breaks down, right? You're 100 kilometers above, and again, sort of like air traffic, even if it's a small country, typically an airplane will spend a few minutes inside that airspace. In space, it could be like a fraction of a second, right? But sort of, I guess the broader question behind that is, do you have a view of like, because the way it's right now, okay, so you have like taxes from the government, but then a lot of it is effectively like, let's call it self-regulated, or basically the industry taking care of itself, right? Like you said, nobody wants to destroy their satellites. It's basically game theoretical considerations. Do you see sort
Well,
of like any right balance between public top-down and private commerce bottom-up?
Well, and again, space doesn't care, right? So, you talked about
Yes.
a small country. Once you're in orbit, you are on the world stage, and so if you act irresponsibly or do something irresponsible, that will be judged on the world stage as well. So, when you look at, it is a worldwide problem. If you look at how, we all, everyone, when people talk about congestion and space debris and those type of things, everyone really is looking at low Earth orbit, which is relatively self-healing, right? So that, we do have that, working to our advantage. But you get beyond that, we're now talking at a very, very different way of how do we manage and how do we participate responsibly in those orbits, and that, that becomes a much more difficult question to solve, and therefore requires a much higher degree of international cooperation.
Okay, since you mentioned space debris there, and listeners will be upset, some listeners will be upset if I don't ask about this topic. Is there like a Slingshot or a Tim Solms view of like how serious is that issue actually?
Well, so, anything is space debris. So an object heading out to geosynchronous orbit can lose a fleck of paint as it's going through other orbits, and that becomes a space debris. What we do know is that space debris does not maneuver, right? So I get asked about this all the time. How actively are you tracking space debris? Truth is not active because it's not an active space problem. We know it's there. Once we know it's there, even all the way out to, geo and cislunar, right? So understanding where it is. We have recently thought something was static or a dead object, and then all of a sudden we saw it maneuver and we're like, okay, wait a minute, that wasn't at all what we thought it was, and that becomes an object of interest, like we talked about before. But debris is and will be a part and parcel of space operations, right? It's going to occur. Last 2 weeks ago, we tracked a first in orbit refueling, right? We tracked two objects, coming together, and it was an in space refueling. And if you go, look at what we put out in public, we put out the imagery of those occurring. That was fascinating to watch. So I do see the problem getting more attention, right? It can't be ignored, just like global ecology can't be ignored. However, it will always be a byproduct of us operating in space.
And I saw this news headline on the in-space refueling. Was that something you knew was going to happen, or is that something you saw two spacecraft suddenly approaching each other and then you decided to take a
So
look
I
at the
did not
discovery?
know it was going to happen, right? So I got, hey, we're about to put this out, and I thought it was fascinating. Again, I always think these are the days of miracle and wonder, right? But I saw that, and later, we had orbital analysts and astrodynamicists explain to me what was going on, because again, I did not come from space as a background. My background's very, very different. I'm a data and AI guy, but very lucky to be in this. But no, so I did not know. I'm not sure if our team knew or not, but I heard very quickly that it was on orbit refueling. And so you think about potentially being able to bring dead objects back to life, or extending, sustainability, a problem for all of us, extending that life. And then you say, okay, if I am going to go, fly in formation with another object to refuel it, what do I need to know? The speed and the complexity at which that's happening. You have to have the data. You have to have the eyes on. You have to be able to, when I think about in-air refueling, right, we block off huge areas of airspace for that to occur, because, both the refueler and the aircraft that's taking on fuel are completely focused on what they're doing, right? Their situational awareness is down to finite, right? You're watching micro movements of both aircraft. So what's going on in the more macro level is huge. So you have to have that comprehensive look at the macro environment to be able to pull something like that off successfully.
That makes a lot of sense. And that was actually the broader question I was gonna get at, sort of how pervasive, and that's not just Slingshot, right? That's sort of asking about the sector. How pervasive is our domain awareness? And sort of the fun version of this question, which I asked one of the other related companies, I forget who it was sort of basically if there was like an actual true alien spacecraft kind of intersecting with low Earth orbit, and let's assume they don't have any sort of exotic camouflage technology that we just can't crack. Would would we actually observe it or not?
Well, I mean, again, that photometry is, there's an elegance to that, right? And we do some near IR stuff. We have the ability to do daytime collection, but if something's reflecting, we're going to see it, right? And so,
Mhm.
we do observe things and track things that are not categorized yet. I'm constantly pushing the team to focus more resources there, but again, like anybody, we're using our resources in areas that we can monetize, and we're constantly saying, hey, we know red, we know blue, but we also have this layer of gray. Our ability to use that photometric fingerprint to say, hey, it looks like it's this class of object or this family of object, and here's what it's doing and how it's behaving. So what we know, we are constantly moving to that, because that comprehensive space data catalog that I talked about is great. but saying, hey, and here are all the objects that are out there that we don't know what they are. That's informative, but not always helpful.
Mhm.
We're
Yeah.
looking constantly increase that.
Okay, fascinating, like this macro perspective. But let's circle back to Slingshot. So what's next for Slingshot? What are some like exciting, non-confidential things you're looking forward to in terms of milestones? And then what is sort of a longer term, 10-year or whatever the right time frame is,
Yeah.
vision for
So
the company?
the market's fascinating, and I'm very, very grateful that there is a level of communication amongst the CEOs that is helpful for me. I know that our lead scientists, our lead data people are also communicating laterally, while we're also, so that is extremely helpful. When I watch the pace at which things are changing, right, we have to be able to innovate. So Slingshot continues to innovate. We're raising a round of capital right now because we're in the growth stage. We've culturally built the muscle that says, hey, if you have an idea and you want, and let's bring that through, let's build that business case, let's inspect that business case, and then at the department head level, we'll coordinate and make the decision, will we capitalize this or not? And right now, we're building more, that list of prioritized capital investment business cases that says, okay, it's time for another shot of investment capital. Again, we're 8 years old. We've got 3 acquisitions in our history. All 3 of those went remarkably well for an early stage, relatively small company. They changed not only the direction of Slingshot, but I think a little bit of our market. And there is more of that to come, right? We've outpaced our expectations on AI development. And so what I do see, for us in the next 2 years, we will continue to double down AI. If you Google Slingshot and Agatha, like Agatha is one of our AI tools that's out there in the public domain. What we built to analyze behavior in mega constellations, has given us more use cases than we expected. So AI has been our great differentiator. The company was built again with all the data and the curation of that data to focus on space operations, but our AI has given us market or brand permission to say we not only focus on people that are in space, but the AI has given us market availability to people who rely upon space, right? So that has been huge for us. And I continue to see it as an area that is a wise use of our investment dollars. So we also look and go, okay, everybody's looking to innovate. So there are some strategics that are popping up here. Everybody knows about SpaceX. We see Anduril, we see Palantir, not the strategics that we would have thought of a few years ago, but they are definitely setting themselves up, in this market. There are, Australia is throwing up a tremendous amount of space activity and capability that I'm keeping very, very close eyes on. But I do believe there will be consolidation in the market. I think through all phases, the launch payload, the orbital ops, and then the downstream side where we focus. But what's driving that? What's driving that is the availability of dollars in the market, right? And the need to innovate. So we have to be innovating, right? Stasis is death right now for us, right? So if you're not constantly saying what next, what next, what next, and pushing yourselves and getting better and better, you're going to run out of, again, I was a pilot for a career. You run out of airspeed, you stall, and that's where we are. So when we look at, companies that have relatively narrow market, or total available market, or asset, they're like in a place where, okay, if I can't innovate, then I'm going to have to, get acquired or merge or sell, in order to keep that part of the technology up and moving. So what I want to make sure is that the key users of whatever it is that we do continue to have optionality, right? We do not want to create, monolithic, monopolistic companies inside space. We've got to be able to continue to provide that optionality, which means, companies like yours that are putting seed stage dollars out there are absolutely critical.
Okay, that makes sense. Tim, as we're winding down here towards the end of the episode, I just realized I didn't actually ask you about your own background. I heard you just said you were a pilot for a while. I think you said before AI and data analysis as well. But how did you end up in the CEO chair at Slingshot?
Well, I'd say by an act of grace, but yeah, so I grew up in a military family. I lived all over the world. I joined the Army when I was 17. I enlisted in the Army. I went to the Citadel in South Carolina, was commissioned,
Hmm.
and had a career in the Army. I was an Apache pilot, right? So I flew low and slow and flew attack helicopters. 25 years ago, I was really recruited out of the cockpit and went into technology. And so I started off in hardware, right? And so massive, growth in hardware around 2000. I saw that was being commoditized. And I'm like, okay, move software is the path to go. So again, always doing government, federal, defense, public sector work. Move to software, enterprise level software, huge growth, huge relevance to the market. But again, you start getting large. I ran the defense business at Microsoft, right? Massive,
Okay.
massive. But you start to see that that's starting to get commoditized, or the curve starts to flatten a little bit. And that's where I made the decision to move into data, and really enjoy the data world, because with any corpus of data, there's so much that you can do with it. Wound up in private equity, taking a big financial technology company, private, restructuring it. And I was working there again in support of the public sector markets. Took it public again, went back into private equity, where I was really doing operating partner work, looking predominantly at dual use spaces, data focused companies, where in Slingshot was looking for a CEO. And I did my diligence on the company. I was actually, I had four, to include Slingshot, I had four CEO opportunities that were in front of me. And I looked at it and I kept saying, that is the one that's the most interesting. Space, there is growing and will continue to grow at that exponential pace. And then what you can do with data analytics, ML, AI, and space is just absolutely incredible. And so, yeah, I was fortunate that I had an opportunity to join, and I'm in my second year, and it's better than I thought, right? So my diligence process was insufficient to, what the time in Slingshot's been.
So obviously you're 110% focused on Slingshot right now, but hypothetically speaking, since you just did mention there that, space was growing and interesting in general, are there any other areas of particular commercial space you find fascinating?
Well, it's funny because, the cost of customer acquisition in commercial is very high right now, right? So as compared to, like I said, US and allied governments. And because if you're not at full scale, then, you look at what your requirements are. But I do see that curve changing, or the vector to that changing, where, we talked about the move to autonomous operations. And if I'm right or wrong at that sort of 6 to 7 quarters, that is going to bring that commercial market forward. I do continue to see commercial as the fastest part of space on the innovative side. We're going to see more innovation faster in commercial than we will see in government. And so that's where I'm watching to see what's next from a capabilities perspective. I mean, pharmacies in space, data centers in space. We've talked a lot about AI today. Data centers on Earth are going to rapidly run out of room, run out of, capacity, run out of, the ability to consume energy. And so our appetite for AI is not going to decrease. So there's got to
Hmm.
be other ways to do that. So I do see, continued expansion of commerce in space as definitely within the next 10 years.
Tim, our last question on this podcast is always the same, and it's about science fiction and whether you enjoy science fiction, and if so, what could be one of your favorites? And it could be a book or a movie or a TV series or even anime or just science fiction in general.
Yeah, it's funny. I told you I went to the Citadel, and
Mm.
one of my classmates is a guy named Pat Childs. And Pat spent time in the Marine Corps, but he was always a super creative. And he, about 6 or 7 years ago, started writing books, all science fiction, all focused on space. And any of my Citadel classmates will know him because of some drawings he used to do for us back in the day. But you know, I really enjoy seeing how he continues to think about space. But for me, we get surprised by space every day, right? Every day. Now, we've gotten used to being surprised. We're like, oh, well, that's new. Hey, we're watching two objects fly in formation. Oh, they're doing, on orbit refueling. Oh, okay. And then we move on to the next thing. So we've become so used to those miracles and wonders that occur in space that it becomes sort of commonplace. But there are still things that are wildly surprising to us, and things that we haven't even considered yet, that will happen within years, not decades. And so, I'm again so fortunate to be here, so grateful to our co-founders that they created this company they get to run. But I'm going to hang on to this one as long as I can, because this has been the most rewarding and fascinating part of my entire career.
And I hope it's going to continue to be for a few years. Tim, thank you so much for coming on and telling about Slingshot and space in general, and your career. And yeah, best of luck for the future.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
And that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. And once more, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as Apple or Spotify. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. We're also on LinkedIn under the Space Business Podcast. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may even include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in becoming a sponsor, or really for any other suggestions, you can drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and see you for the next episode.